In this video we will explore what medieval peasants would eat in Europe. In this video we will go through different times and see how food changed. If you enjoy these videos, please feel free to leave a like and/or subscribe. Now let's get started, so sit back, relax, and enjoy. Imagine waking before sunrise in a small village somewhere in northern France. The year is 1150. The air is cold. The walls of your home are packed earth and timber, and the first thing you smell before you even open your eyes is smoke. Not the clean smoke of a fireplace you've seen in films, but the thick, low-hanging haze of a central hearth with nowhere to go. Your eyes sting. Your lungs have adapted. You are peasant. And breakfast, if you're lucky, is already waiting. For the vast majority of people living in medieval Europe, roughly 85 to 90% of the population life was agricultural, local, and organized almost entirely around the question of food. Not the pleasure of food. Not the variety of food. Simply, enough food. The rhythms of the medieval peasant calendar were the rhythms of the harvest, and everything: feast days, fasting days, marriage seasons, even was bent around what the land could produce. So what did they actually eat? The answer, for most of medieval Europe and most of the medieval period, can be summed up in a single word: pottage. Pottage was not a recipe. It was a concept. It was whatever you had, boiled together in a pot, until soft. At its most basic, pottage was little more than water thickened with oats or barley, perhaps flavored with a handful of wild herbs, nettles, leeks, or onion tops gathered from the edges of the field. At its richer end, pottage might include dried peas or beans, root vegetables, scraps of salted pork fat, and whatever leafy greens were in season. The pot was rarely emptied entirely. Each day, new ingredients were added to what remained from the day before. Some pots, it was said, simmered for weeks on end. This was not laziness or poor cooking. This was practical genius. Every calorie mattered. Nothing was wasted. But before the pottage, there was bread, and bread tells us almost everything we need to know about where someone stood in medieval society. The wealthy ate white bread, made from finely milled wheat flour with a bran and germ sifted out. It was soft, pale, and prestigious. The church used it for communion. Lords served it at their tables. Peasants, by contrast, ate what was called muslin bread, or, lower still, black bread. Muslin was a mix of wheat and rye, whatever ratio the harvest allowed that year. Black bread was made from rye alone, or from rye mixed with oats, barley, or even ground legumes like dried peas when grain was short. It was dense, dark, slightly sour, and it kept for days, sometimes weeks. It had to. You didn't bake every morning. You baked in batches when you had fuel and flour, and you made it last. In some regions, particularly in Scandinavia and northern Germany, bread wasn't baked at all in the soft sense we'd recognize. Instead, flatbreads and hard rye crackers, called knackebrod, were dried until almost stone-hard, threaded on poles, and hung from the rafters to preserve them through winter. The bread was the meal. Pottage, vegetables, whatever else existed, these were, in a sense, the accompaniment. Now, when we talk about medieval peasant food, it's important to resist two temptations that modern people often fall into. The first is romanticization, the idea that peasants ate some kind of pure, wholesome, farm-to-table diet that we've somehow lost. There's a kernel of truth here. The food was unprocessed, seasonal, and locally grown. But it was also monotonous to a degree that is genuinely difficult for us to comprehend. The same pottage, the same bread, the same flavor profile, day after day, season after season. Variety was a luxury. The second temptation is the opposite: pure misery. The image of starving, hollow-eyed peasants eating mud and bark. This was sometimes true. Famine years were catastrophic, and we'll come to those, but in ordinary years, In productive regions, peasants could eat adequately. Not well by our standards, but adequately. Enough to work, to grow, to carry children and raise them. The truth, as ever, sits somewhere between the romantic and the grim. Let's talk about grain, because grain was everything. In Northern Europe, England, France, the Low Countries, Germany, the dominant grains were wheat, rye, barley, and oats. Which grain you grew and ate depended enormously on where you lived. Wheat preferred warm, well-drained soils. Rye was hardier and tolerated poor, sandy, acidic soils that wheat couldn't survive. Oats thrived in the cool, wet climates of Scotland and Ireland. Barley went almost everywhere, and crucially, it was the grain most often used for something else we'll come back to, ale. In southern Europe, Italy, Spain, the south of France, the picture was somewhat different. Here, wheat was more dominant, and the diet shifted accordingly toward flatbreads and, eventually, pasta. Legumes were more prominent. Lentils, chickpeas, and fava beans formed the backbone of the diet alongside grain. Olive oil replaced the lard and animal fat that northern peasants depended on. The Mediterranean peasant and the northern peasant were eating from recognizably different tables, even if both were eating simply. Back to our village in northern France. Your morning meal, what later centuries would call breakfast, though that word carried different weight, there might be a thick porridge of oats or barley cooked with water, perhaps thinned with a little whey left over from cheese-making. If it was autumn, after the harvest, there might be a small piece of bread. A cup of ale. Yes, ale in the morning, weak ale, barely fermented, what they called small bay. This was not indulgence. Water sources in medieval settlements were frequently contaminated. The light fermentation process that made ale made it safer. Children drank it too. There was no sugar in this morning meal. No fruit, in most seasons. Possibly no salt, since salt was expensive, taxed and traded, sometimes used as currency. Flavor, where it existed, came from herbs, thyme, sage, parsley, and the ever-present onion, which grew easily and added precious depth to otherwise blank food. You ate. You went to the fields. And that, in many ways, is the first lesson of medieval peasant food. It was fuel, first and foremost. The question was never, what shall we have for supper tonight? The question was, will there be enough? The peasant diet was calibrated not to pleasure but to labor, to sustaining bodies that worked from gray dawn to dim dusk, 6 days a week, for most of the year. It needed to be calorie-dense and filling. Pottage and black bread, for all their simplicity, accomplished that. Over the next 35 minutes, we'll move beyond the morning porridge. We'll look at what peasants could drink, what they grew in their kitchen gardens, how the seasons transformed their diet, and what happened when the harvest failed. We'll meet the pigs that fed entire villages through winter, taste the preserved foods that made survival possible, and discover that peasant cooking, humble as it was, contained a genuine and underappreciated ingenuity. But it all begins here, with a pot on a fire, with a loaf of dark bread, with a cup of weak ale in the cold morning air, with the simple, ancient question, is there enough? If you walk through a medieval village in high summer, say, July, somewhere in the English Midlands, around the year 1200, you would notice something that surprises many people when they first learn about it. Tucked behind almost every peasant dwelling, between the back wall of the house and the boundary of the common field, was a small plot of cultivated ground. Not a farm, not even a garden in the ornamental sense we might picture today. Something smaller and more purposeful than that. A toft, it was sometimes called, or croft. A kitchen garden, a survival garden. This little patch of earth was, in many ways, the most important piece of ground a peasant family controlled. The village fields, those long, open strips of land that medieval peasants farmed under the collective open field system, produced the grain. That was their job. Wheat, rye, barley, oats, the great caloric engine of the medieval diet. But the grain fields were communally regulated. You planted what the village decided to plant. You followed the rotation, one field in autumn crops, one in spring crops, one left fallow to recover. You had a say, but not total control. The kitchen garden was yours. And in that garden grew something the grain fields could not provide: variety. Peasant kitchen gardens were remarkably productive for their size. Archaeological evidence, estate records, and the agricultural manuals that literate monks and landowners left behind give us a surprisingly detailed picture of what grew in them. Legumes were the cornerstone. Peas and broad beans, field beans, dried and fresh, were perhaps the single most important crop after grain, because they did something grain could not. They provided protein. Not meat protein, which was expensive and scarce for most peasant families most of the time, but plant protein, filling and sustaining. A pottage thick with dried peas and beans was not a poor imitation of a meat meal. It was its own thing, and it worked. Leeks were everywhere. The leek was to the medieval peasant garden what the tomato would become to later centuries: reliable, versatile, and deeply embedded in the cooking. Leeks went into pottage, into broths, into the pot on their own, braised soft in water or fat. They flavored everything. Onions and garlic, two grown in every garden from Portugal to Poland, fundamental to the flavor of nearly every cooked dish. Cabbage and its relatives, kale, colewort, and other leafy brassicas that could survive cold and be harvested well into autumn and even early winter. Parsnips and turnips, which stored well underground through the coldest months. Herbs, not decorative ones, but practical ones. Parsley, sage, mint, and fennel, used to stretch flavor in a diet that was otherwise almost entirely bland. What peasants did not have, it's worth pausing to note, tells us as much as what they did. There were no potatoes in medieval Europe. The potato was a New World crop, unknown until the late 16th century at the very earliest, and not widely adopted in European peasant diets until the 17th and 18th centuries. No tomatoes. No sweet peppers. No maize. No chocolate. No chilies. The Columbian Exchange, the transfer of crops between the Old and New Worlds following 1492, transformed European peasant diets so fundamentally that it is genuinely difficult, looking back, to overstate its importance. But in the medieval period, none of that had happened yet. The flavors available to a medieval peasant cook were narrower than we might assume. Sharp, bitter, earthy, sour. Sweetness was rare and precious. Salt was expensive. Spices, pepper, cinnamon, ginger existed, but they were traded luxuries, far beyond the reach of village kitchens. The flavor of peasant food was honest and austere. Beyond the kitchen garden, the landscape itself was a food source, and this is something that often gets overlooked when people think about medieval diets. The forest was not merely scenery. For peasant communities across Europe, the forest was a larder. In autumn, peasants exercised rights often carefully negotiated and legally defined to take their pigs into the forest to feed on fallen acorns and beech mast. This practice, called pottage, was so economically important that it appears in countless medieval documents, including the famous English Domesday Book of 1086, which recorded the size of forests partly by how many pigs they could support. The pig was the great democratic animal of medieval peasant life. Cattle were expensive and valuable primarily as working animals. You didn't eat your ox if you needed it to plow. Sheep provided wool, which was money. But a pig could eat almost anything, required little care, fattened quickly on forest mast in autumn, and was slaughtered in November or December, just as the cold set in, to provide preserved meat through the winter months. Pig Slaughter Day was one of the most significant events in the peasant calendar. The entire animal was used. Nothing was discarded. Fresh pork was eaten immediately, because it wouldn't keep. The rest was salted, smoked, or cured into bacon, lard, and sausages. The fat lard was as important as the meat itself. It was cooking fat, a spread for bread, and an additional calorie source in a diet that was always at risk of falling short. The forest also provided something free and requiring no cultivation at all, gathered foods. Wild plants, berries, and fungi formed a meaningful supplement to the cultivated diet, particularly in spring, when stored food from the previous harvest was running low and the new crops were nowhere near ready. This period, roughly February through May, depending on the region, was known as the Hungry Gap, and it was genuinely dangerous. Spring was, paradoxically, one of the most food-insecure times of year for medieval peasants. Into that gap stepped the hedgerow and the woodland. Blackberries, elderberries, sloe berries, wild cherries, crabapples gathered in late summer and autumn for immediate eating or simple preservation. Wild garlic, nettles, sorrel, and watercress greens gathered in early spring, when they were among the first edible things to appear. Mushrooms in autumn, hazelnuts in September, chestnuts in October, which in southern Europe, especially France, Italy, Spain, and Portugal, were ground into flour and became a genuine dietary staple for highland communities who struggled to grow grain. The chestnut is one of the great unsung foods of medieval Europe. In the Apennine Mountains of Italy and the Massif Central of France, entire communities survived lean years partly on chestnut flour bread, chestnut porridge, and roasted chestnuts. They called the chestnut tree El Albero del Pane, the bread tree. Then there was water, and from water, fish. For much of medieval Europe, the Christian calendar imposed a dietary structure that shaped food culture in profound ways. Meat, the flesh of four-legged animals, was prohibited on Fridays, on Saturdays in some traditions, and throughout the 40 days of Lent before Easter. In a strict interpretation of the medieval religious calendar, as many as 150 days per year could be classified as fish days or fast days. For wealthy people, this was no hardship. Elaborate fish dishes, imported salted herring, fresh pike from stock ponds, the rich ate well on fast days too. For peasants, the fish day was a simpler affair. Those living near rivers or the coast could catch freshwater fish, bream, pike, roach, eel, or have access to sea fish. The eel deserves a particular mention here. Eels were abundant in medieval rivers and wetlands, easy to trap and calorie-rich. They appear constantly in medieval records as a form of rent, peasants paying their dues to landlords and eels, by the hundreds, sometimes the thousands. But for inland peasants far from any river, the fish day often meant something humbler: dried and salted herring, traded inland from the coasts, preserved in barrels of brine. Herring was the cod of its era, the cheap, abundant, nutritious fish of ordinary people. It smelled terrible when salted and dried. It was eaten anyway, without complaint, because the alternative was nothing. So here, then, is the medieval peasant's relationship with the landscape laid bare. The grain field fed you. The kitchen garden saved you from monotony and provided protein. The forest gave you your pig and your nuts and your gathered greens. The river or the coast gave you eel and herring on the days the church demanded you eat no meat. And through all of it ran the constant, grinding arithmetic of subsistence. What have we grown? What have we stored? What have we gathered? And will it be enough to last until the next harvest? It was not a bad life. In good years, a peasant community could eat adequately, drink their small ale, slaughter their pig in November, and settle in for winter with enough salted meat and dried legumes to see them through. But good years were not guaranteed. And in the next segment, we'll turn to what the diet looked like through the turning of the seasons and what happened when the seasons turned against you. There is a temptation, when studying medieval peasant food, to flatten time, to imagine the diet as a static thing, the same pottage, the same bread, the same routine, day after day, year after year, unchanging as the stone walls of the village church. But medieval peasant eating was not static. It pulsed. It swelled and contracted with the seasons, with the liturgical calendar, with the luck of the weather, and with the terrifying unpredictability of harvests that could mean the difference between a full belly and a slow death. To understand what peasants ate, you have to understand the medieval experience of time, which was nothing like our own. The medieval year was not a flat line of identical days. It was a landscape with peaks and valleys, shaped by two overlapping systems, the agricultural calendar and the Christian liturgical calendar. These two systems reinforced each other so completely that, by the high medieval period, they had become almost indistinguishable. The church knew when the harvest came in. The harvest knew when the feast days fell. Let's begin with the peaks, the feasts. Christmas was the greatest feast of the winter, and for peasant communities it arrived at exactly the right biological moment. November and December were slaughter months. The pig had been fattened through autumn on forest mast and kitchen scraps. The cattle and sheep that couldn't be fed through winter had been killed. Fresh meat, actual, unpreserved. Roasted meat was available, briefly, in quantities it almost never was at any other time of year. A peasant Christmas feast was not the elaborate banquet of the manor hall, but by the ordinary standards of peasant eating, it was extraordinary. Fresh pork, perhaps a goose or a chicken if the family kept poultry, bread made from the newly milled autumn grain, an ale brewed for the occasion stronger than the thin small beer of daily life, flavored with spices if they could be afforded, or with local herbs if they couldn't. In England, a spiced ale called wassail was drunk communally, passed in a shed bowl. In Germany, a dark, thick winter ale. In France, new wine from the autumn's pressing. The feasting wasn't purely celebratory. It was also strategic. Fresh meat couldn't be stored. Eating it now, together, in community, was the rational thing to do. The medieval feast was as much about preventing waste as it was about joy, though the joy was real, and the peasant communities who gathered around those fires in December knew how to be grateful for abundance when it briefly came. Easter was the other great feast, and it arrived, by design or divine coincidence, at one of the most psychologically important moments of the year. Lent, the 40 days of fasting and abstinence before Easter, fell across late winter and early spring. This was already, as we noted in the last segment, the hungry gap. Stored food was running low. The fields were bare or barely sprouting. The church, in requiring its followers to abstain from meat and, in stricter observances, from eggs and dairy as well, was in some ways simply codifying what was already a lean time of year. The end of Lent and the arrival of Easter Sunday broke the fast in every sense simultaneously. Spring had come. The first fresh greens were appearing. Lambs born in late winter were old enough to slaughter. Hens, whose laying had slowed through winter, were producing eggs again. The Easter feast wasn't just a religious celebration. It was the sensory eruption of spring after months of cold and scarcity. Eggs, lamb, fresh cheese, green herbs, these weren't just foods. They were proof that the world had survived another winter. Between the great feasts, the liturgical calendar offered smaller moments of relief and rhythm. Saints' days and medieval Christianity observed dozens of them throughout the year, often came with local traditions of special food or drink. The Harvest Festival in autumn, Michaelmas in late September, Martinmas in November. Each had its associated foods, its communal meals, its brief acknowledgement that the work of the season was done. These weren't luxuries in the dismissive sense. They were psychologically essential. A life of unrelenting labor, monotonous food, and constant uncertainty needed its punctuation marks. The feast days provided them. But now we must turn from the peaks to the valleys. Because for every feast in the medieval year, there were long stretches of fast, and beyond the voluntary fasting of religious observance, there was something far more frightening. There was famine. Medieval Europe was not a food-secure society. The margin between adequacy and catastrophe was thin, and it narrowed dramatically in bad years. The agricultural system of the period was genuinely fragile by modern standards. Crop yields were low. A medieval farmer might expect to harvest 3 or 4 grains for every one he planted, compared to the 20 or 30 to 1 ratio that modern agriculture achieves. This meant that a significant portion of every harvest had to be set aside as seed grain for the following year. It could not be eaten. In a bad harvest year, this constraint became agonizing. And bad harvest years came. They came from late frosts that killed young grain in May, from summer droughts that shriveled the ears before they could fill, from too much rain that rotted grain in the field or caused flooding that drowned crops in the lowlands, from the fungal disease ergot, which infected rye and produced a toxin that caused convulsions, hallucinations, and gangrene in those who ate it, a condition known in medieval Europe as St. Anthony's fire, terrifying and not understood to be caused by contaminated grain until centuries later. A single bad harvest was survivable. Just stored grain from previous years, reduced consumption, emergency purchases from wealthier neighbors or the local lord communities could manage one lean year. 2 consecutive bad harvests began to kill people. 3 in a row produced catastrophe. The most devastating famine of the medieval period and one of the worst in all of European history struck in the early 14th century. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 was caused by a sustained period of catastrophic weather. Beginning in the spring of 1315, unusually cold temperatures and relentless rainfall across northern Europe destroyed harvests for multiple consecutive years. The grain failed. The hay failed, which meant livestock died. Livestock deaths meant less manure, which further depleted soils for subsequent seasons. The crisis compounded itself in a spiraling cascade that medieval people had no tools to interrupt. What followed was not merely hunger. Contemporary chronicles describe people eating dogs, cats, and the bark of trees. In the worst affected areas, northern France, the Low Countries, parts of England and Germany, credible reports emerged of the desperate consuming the bodies of the dead. Mortality estimates for the famine years range widely, but most historians believe that somewhere between 10 and 15% of the population of northern Europe died. In some urban areas, the death toll was higher. This was not an ancient world problem. This was happening in sophisticated, relatively developed medieval kingdoms, with functioning governments, established churches, and centuries of agricultural practice behind them. It happened anyway, because the food system had no resilience against sustained climatic failure. For the ordinary peasant who lived through a famine year short of the absolute catastrophe of 1315, the experience was one of progressive substitution and desperate creativity. When grain ran short, you stretched what remained by mixing in whatever could be ground into flour. Dried peas and beans, the protein staples of the kitchen garden, were ground and mixed with grain flour. Acorns, bitter and tannic in their raw state, were leached in water and dried, then ground. Chestnuts, where available, the bark of certain trees. Clay, in documented cases of extreme desperation, not for nutrition, since clay provides none, but because the physical sensation of fullness in the stomach suppressed the pain of hunger for a few hours. The animals ate differently too, or rather, they were eaten. In a famine, the calculation around livestock changed completely. The ox that would normally be protected at all costs as a working animal became food. The dairy cow that provided milk and cheese was slaughtered. The seed grain that had to be preserved for next year's planting was eaten anyway, by families who faced immediate starvation and could not defer their survival to a future that felt impossibly distant. This was the true cruelty of famine. Eating your seed grain saved you today and destroyed you tomorrow. Medieval peasant communities understood this. They made the choice anyway, because what else do you do? And yet, and this is important, the story of medieval peasant food is not primarily a story of famine. Famines happened. They were devastating when they did. But they were the exception, not the norm. The norm was something less dramatic and more textured, a life shaped by seasonal abundance and seasonal scarcity, by feast days and fast days, by the reliable monotony of pottage punctuated by the occasional extraordinary meal, by the pleasure, and it was genuine pleasure, of a cup of ale after a day in the fields, or a shared bowl of warm food in winter with people you loved. The peasants who sat around their hearths in good years were not miserable people. They were people living lives of significant constraint, but also of community, of rhythm, of a relationship with the land and with food that was immediate and real in a way that few of us today can claim. They knew where their food came from. They had grown it themselves. In our final segment, we'll bring all of this together and we'll look at the one element of medieval peasant eating that we've circled around but not yet fully explored: drink, preservation, and the surprising sophistication of what humble ingredients, in skilled hands, could actually produce. Because medieval peasant cooking, for all its austerity, was not without its own quiet art. There is a phrase that appears, in various forms, across many different languages and many different centuries of European peasant life. In French, faire avec. In English, simply, making do. It captures something essential about the peasant relationship with food, not passive resignation, but active, intelligent adaptation. The art of taking what is available, which is rarely what you would choose, and turning it into something that sustains life, and occasionally, something that transcends mere sustenance entirely. In this final segment, we're going to look at three things that embody that art: drink, dairy, and preservation, and the quiet sophistication that existed within a cuisine that history has largely dismissed as too simple to be worth noticing. Let's begin with ale, because ale was not a luxury in medieval peasant life. It was a staple, as fundamental to the diet as bread. We touched on small B earlier, the weak, lightly fermented daily drink that was safer than water and provided a modest caloric supplement to the diet. But ale in medieval Europe was a broader and more interesting subject than that. Medieval ale was not what we would recognize today as beer. It was brewed without hops, which were not widely adopted in English brewing until the 15th century and even later in some regions. Instead, ale was flavored and preserved, to the limited extent it could be, with a mixture of herbs and botanicals collectively known as gruit. Gruit blends varied by region and by brewer, but commonly included yarrow, bog myrtle, and wild rosemary, along with whatever local herbs were available and understood to have preserving properties. The result was a drink that tasted quite different from modern ale. Earthier, more herbal, often slightly sweet from unfermented sugars, since the fermentation process was short and imprecise. Medieval ale didn't keep well. A batch brewed without hops could sour and spoil within days in warm weather. This wasn't a problem for peasant households because they brewed frequently and in small quantities. It was brewed by women. Almost universally, the alewife was a fixture of medieval village life, and the production of ale was considered domestic work, as natural a part of household management as baking bread. The ale consumed daily by peasant families was genuinely weak, perhaps 1 to 2% alcohol by modern estimation. Children drank it. The elderly drank it. You could drink several cups in a day and feel nothing beyond mild hydration. But for feast days and celebrations, a stronger ale was brewed, given longer fermentation, and it was a different creature entirely. This was the wassail bowl of Christmas, the harvest ale of autumn, the wedding ale that gave its name bride ale, or bridal to the wedding celebration itself. Ale was democratic. Wine was not. In southern Europe, the Mediterranean world of Italy, Spain, southern France, and Greece, wine was accessible even to peasants, because grapes grew everywhere, and the labor of winemaking was part of the agricultural cycle in which peasants participated. The wine peasants drank was not fine wine. It was thin, acidic, often diluted with water, and vinegary by the time it had been stored for any length of time. But it was wine, and it was theirs. In northern Europe, wine was an imported luxury, traded up from the south and priced beyond the reach of ordinary village households. The peasant of northern France or England drank ale. The merchant of the same region might drink wine. The division was sharp and understood by everyone. There was a third drink, sitting between the two, that is less well remembered today: mead. Fermented honey and water. Mead was ancient, far older than either ale or wine in northern Europe, and in the medieval period it occupied a curious middle position. It was expensive, because honey was expensive, but it was locally producible, requiring no imported ingredients, and in regions where beekeeping was practiced it appeared at celebrations, at feast days, and in the halls of minor lords who couldn't afford wine but wanted something grander than ale. Now to dairy, and here, the picture of medieval peasant food becomes significantly richer than its reputation suggests. Milk itself was not widely drunk by adults in medieval Europe. This is not merely a matter of preference. A significant proportion of medieval Europeans were, like most of the world's adult population, lactose intolerant to varying degrees. The genetic adaptation that allows many northern Europeans to digest lactose in adulthood is real, and it was spreading during the medieval period, but it was not yet universal. More practically, fresh milk was highly perishable, difficult to transport, and most useful when converted into something that lasted. That something was primarily cheese and butter. Cheese was a peasant food in the most fundamental sense. It was how you preserved the milk of spring and summer, the most productive seasons for dairy animals for consumption through winter. Medieval peasant cheeses were simple by modern standards. Fresh cheeses similar to cottage cheese or ricotta, made by curdling milk with rennet or acid and draining off the whey, and harder aged cheeses that could be pressed, salted, and stored for months. The whey left over from cheese making was not discarded. Nothing was discarded. Whey was drunk, used in cooking, fed to pigs, or used to thin porridge. The medieval kitchen, at its best, was a closed system in which every output of one process became the input of another. Butter, too, was made in spring and summer when milk was plentiful, and preserved for leaner months by salting it heavily, sometimes burying it in peat bogs, a practice particularly common in Ireland and Scotland, where archaeologists have recovered what are now called bog butters, ancient sealed containers of preserved butter, some dating back well beyond the medieval period, their fat somehow still intact after centuries underground. These are not curiosities. They are evidence of a preservation technology that worked reliably in a world without refrigeration. Preservation, in fact, was perhaps the single most important culinary skill in the medieval peasant world. And it was genuine skill, accumulated knowledge, passed through generations, tested by survival. Salt was the universal preservative, and its importance cannot be overstated. The great salt-producing regions of medieval Europe, the salt marshes of the Atlantic coast of France, the rock salt mines of Central Europe, the salt pans of the Mediterranean, were significant economic and political assets. Wars were fought over salt. Tax structures were built around it. The French gabelle hated the salt tax and was a cause of genuine popular resentment for centuries. For peasants, salt was used to cure pork into bacon, to brine fish into something that could travel hundreds of miles inland and last through winter, to preserve cheese and butter, and to extend the life of vegetables through the lean months. Salted and fermented vegetables, sauerkraut, pickled root vegetables, preserved cabbage, and turnip were common across northern Europe, produced in households without any formal recipe, by the same intuitive fermentation knowledge that produced ale. Smoking worked alongside salt. Hams and fish hung in the smoke above the central hearth were simultaneously cooked, dried, and chemically preserved by the compounds in wood smoke. The smoked eel. The smoked herring, known in England as a red herring for the deep rust color it developed after days over oak and beech smoke. The smoked bacon rasher. These were not flavor preferences. They were technologies. Drying preserved fruits, herbs, and some vegetables through the summer heat. Potting, packing cooked meat under a seal of fat extended its life by weeks. Fermenting transformed perishable grain into ale and preserved cabbage into something that would keep through a northern winter. And here, if we pause and look at this inventory of techniques honestly, something remarkable emerges. Medieval peasant food is often written off as primitive, as the absence of sophistication, the absence of choice. But look at what these communities actually accomplished with the ingredients and tools available to them. They fermented grain into a safe, calorie-providing drink without understanding microbiology. They preserved meat through an entire winter without refrigeration. They maintained the fertility of their soil through a 3-field rotation system that was empirically derived and genuinely effective. They produced dozens of varieties of preserved dairy. They managed common woodland resources across whole communities without written contracts. They fed themselves and their children and their animals through seasons and famines and wars, using nothing but accumulated knowledge, communal cooperation, and patient, repetitive, unglamorous work. This is not a trivial achievement. In a world that has now industrialized its food system to a degree that makes those skills almost entirely invisible, it is worth sitting with that for a moment. Let us close where we began, in that small house, before sunrise, with the smoke and the cold and the pot on the fire. The person standing at that hearth did not eat well by our standards. They lacked variety, lacked spice, lacked sugar, lacked almost everything that modern food culture considers essential to pleasure. Their diet was shaped by constraint at every turn, by what the land produced, by what the church permitted, by what the weather allowed, by what they could preserve and store and stretch through the hungry months. But they were not without knowledge. They were not without skill. And they were not, in the good years, without joy. The shed ale at harvest's end. The Christmas pork, fresh and fragrant over the fire. The first spring greens after months of salted meat and dried beans. The Easter eggs, boiled and cracked open with children crowded around. These moments were small by the standards of the medieval Great Hall or by our own. But they were real, and they were felt, and the people who experienced them were not so different from us in the ways that matter. They were hungry when there was nothing, and grateful when there was something, and occasionally, briefly, they feasted. And in those moments, the distinction between the peasant's table and the lord's, for just a few hours, narrowed considerably. Food has always been more than fuel. Even pottage, even black bread, even a cup of weak ale in the cold morning dark. Even then. This concludes the video. Thanks for watching. Sleep well. Good night.